It is July 19th, 2026, and along the road connecting Roudan to Bandar Abbas, there is a bridge that no longer exists in the shape it did 5 days ago. A tunnel nearby is torn open. This is not a rumor pulled from an anonymous Telegram account. This is a road that Iranian state media itself confirmed was hit. A road that matters because it feeds the port city sitting on the narrowest throat of the Strait of Hormuz. For 6 straight nights now, American aircraft have been returning to that stretch of coastline. And for 6 straight nights, Iran has been trying to prove it still controls a waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the planet's daily oil supply. That is not a talking point. That is a fact you can check against a map. And it is the reason this entire war keeps circling back to the same 80 miles of water, no matter how many times both sides claim they are done fighting over it. But that is not even the part that should stop you cold. What should stop you is the timeline underneath it. Because 5 months ago, in the closing days of February, the supreme leader of Iran was killed in a strike attributed to the United States and Israel, and Iran responded the only way a wounded regime with a battered conventional military knows how to respond. It shut the strait, not diplomatically, not with a formal notice to international maritime authorities. It broadcast warnings over open radio channels telling every ship on Earth that no vessel of any flag would be allowed to pass. Read that again. A country that does not own the strait, that shares its narrowest point with Oman on the opposite shore, declared unilateral control over one of the most important choke points in the global economy. And that single decision is the seed of everything that has happened since, including the smoke rising over Bandar Abbas and Qeshm Island this week. But let's back all the way up, because to understand what just happened, you need to understand what has been building for 5 months straight. When Iran shut the strait in the final days of February, it triggered an immediate global energy shock. Shipping firms suspended operations rather than risk their vessels and their crews. Within weeks, the United States and Israel launched a sustained aerial campaign aimed at one specific objective, forcing that waterway back open. By mid-March, that campaign had already destroyed 16 Iranian vessels believed to be laying naval mines in the strait, an operation the Pentagon described at the time as one of the most serious escalations of the young war. By April, the United States had layered a full naval blockade of Iranian ports on top of the air campaign, and President Trump was publicly threatening to destroy Iranian power plants and bridges if the strait did not reopen on his timeline. Oil prices spiked past $115 a barrel that same week. This was not posturing. This was policy backed by ordinance, and it has stayed that way, on and off, for 5 months. And here is where it gets significantly worse than a simple military campaign. Somewhere in that 5-month window, the two sides actually sat down and signed something. A memorandum of understanding, negotiated in June, meant to be the framework for ending the war. Delegations met. A ceasefire took hold. For a moment it looked like the story was closing. And then an Iranian drone slammed into a cargo ship transiting the strait, just 1 week after that preliminary deal was signed. That is not a footnote. That is the entire pattern of this conflict compressed into a single sentence. Sign the deal. Shake the hands. Launch the drone anyway. If you have been paying attention to how this regime operates for the last 5 months, you already know that a signature on a piece of paper has never meant the guns go quiet in the water underneath it. That brings us to the specific numbers of where things actually stand today, because vague language is exactly what lets a story like this get lost in the noise. As of this week, Iran and the United States have now traded strikes for 6 consecutive nights. On the 13th of July, Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed it had struck and disabled 2 vessels it called rogue supertankers, alleging they had switched off their navigation systems and ignored warnings while trying to pass through what Iran labeled a mined route. Strip away the propaganda framing and look at the confirmed casualties underneath it. 2 United Arab Emirates tankers, the Al Bahia and the Mombasa, were hit by Iranian missiles inside Omani territorial waters, not Iranian waters, while an Indian crew member aboard the Mombasa was killed. India, which supplies more seafarers to the global shipping industry than almost any other nation on Earth, more than 300,000 sailors crewing vessels across the world's fleets, has since ordered its ship owners to stop deploying Indian crews through the strait entirely. That is not a symbolic gesture. That is one of the largest labor markets in global shipping, pulling its own people out of a waterway, because it no longer trusts either side to keep them alive inside it. Now, let's talk about what nobody covering this as a 2-minute headline is connecting. Days later, Iran's state news agency reported that 2 tankers had caught fire after striking mines while attempting to cross the strait, again citing the Revolutionary Guard as the source. U.S. Central Command did not hedge on this one. It called the claim false in a public statement, adding the line that, quote, like most IRGC claims, this is false. Read that carefully. That is not a diplomatic non-denial. That is the American military command responsible for the region calling Iran's own state media a liar on the exact subject of mines in the exact waterway everyone is fighting over. Meanwhile, Iran's own Revolutionary Guard described the waterway in a separate statement as now highly unsafe and completely closed. So, in the span of roughly 72 hours, you have Iran claiming mines caused a fire, the United States calling that claim false, and Iran simultaneously declaring the strait closed regardless of who is right about the mines. That is not the fog of war. That is a regime trying to have every version of the story available at once, depending on which audience is listening. This is where the campaign starts to look less like isolated incidents and more like a deliberate American strategy of degradation, block by block, night by night. On the 15th of July, U.S. Central Command confirmed a second consecutive wave of strikes aimed specifically at degrading Iran's ability to threaten vessels transiting the strait. The statement named the target categories directly: command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities, with precision munitions confirmed hitting multiple locations, including Bandar Abbas itself. On that same day, U.S. forces launched a 90-minute round of strikes against Greater Tunb Island, a small but strategically loaded piece of territory that has been described by regional analysts as part of Iran's layered defense of the strait's approaches. 90 minutes is not a single jet making a single pass. That is a sustained strike package working through a target list. And here is where it gets significantly worse. As part of that same operation, Hess forces disabled an empty oil tanker sailing toward Kharg Island, Iran's most important crude export terminal, and the economic lifeline that keeps whatever is left of the regime's oil revenue flowing. Disabling a tanker headed toward Kharg Island is not incidental collateral. It is a direct message about the blockade's teeth. The strait fight and the blockade fight are not two separate stories. They are the same campaign viewed from two different angles. One squeezing what comes out of Iran's ports, the other squeezing what Iran can threaten on the water in front of them. Let's talk for a moment about what actually enables a sustained strike tempo like this. Because 6 consecutive nights of coordinated strikes against command centers, air defense sites, surveillance facilities, and coastal infrastructure does not happen with a single aircraft making a single lucky pass. It happens with a layered air campaign. Carrier-based strike fighters and land-based aircraft flying out of regional basing give the United States the ability to hold targets at risk across the entire strait on a rolling, repeatable schedule rather than a one-off raid. Precision-guided munitions are what let a strike package hit a bridge, a tunnel, and a command center in the same operation without leveling the surrounding neighborhood, which is precisely why Central Command's own language keeps emphasizing precision as the method. Uncrewed aircraft extend that same precision capability over the water for hours at a time, watching for exactly the kind of small, fast, hard-to-track boats Iran has used throughout this conflict to lay mines and harass shipping without risking a pilot in the process. None of that is exotic or secret. It is the standard publicly documented toolkit the United States has maintained in this region for years. What is notable is not the hardware itself. What is notable is the discipline of the targeting. Command centers first, because that is the nervous system. Surveillance next, because that is the eyes. Air defenses alongside both, because that is what makes every subsequent strike safer and easier than the one before it. That sequencing is not an accident. It is a campaign plan executing exactly as campaign plans against layered coastal defenses are designed to execute, one severed link at a time. And that targeting logic is exactly why the physical geography of Bandar Abbas matters as much as it does. This is not just any port city. It sits at the absolute narrowest pinch point of the entire strait. The stretch of water so tight that a handful of shore-based missile batteries and a swarm of small, fast boats can genuinely threaten to close it to shipping, even against the most powerful navy in the world. That is the entire logic of what analysts have called Iran's layered coastal defense of the strait's approaches, a defense built not around matching the United States ship for ship or jet for jet, which Iran cannot do, but around denial. Enough mines, enough small boats, enough shore-based missiles, enough surveillance to coordinate all three, and even a fraction of that capability surviving is enough to make insurers nervous, shipping companies cautious, and oil markets jumpy. That is why every strike this week has clustered around the same few square miles of coastline. That is where the actual leverage lives, not in Tehran, not in a negotiating room in Doha or Muscat, but in the specific radar sites, command bunkers, and boat pens strung along the approaches to Bandar Abbas and out onto Qeshm and Greater Tunb. But the military side of this story is not even the most alarming part once you follow the money and the geography together. This waterway carries roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas shipments. That is the actual scale of what is being fought over between Rudan and Bandar Abbas. Every night of strikes, every disabled tanker, every mine claim, real or fabricated, ripples outward into fuel prices and shipping insurance premiums on a global scale, not a regional one. 17 merchant ships have now been damaged since this crisis began, 7 of them abandoned outright by their crews, 2 of them captured. 12 seafarers are dead or missing, A tugboat has been sunk, a port worker in Bahrain was killed, and 2 more wounded. This is not an abstraction happening somewhere far away on a map. This is a body count attached to a body of water that decides whether fuel prices spike on the other side of the planet. Now read that again and sit with it for a second, because this is the detail that changes how you should be watching everything else in this story. Gulf states have had to respond to this crisis directly. The formation of what is now being called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because regional states needed some kind of coordinating structure to manage a waterway that neither Iran nor the international shipping community could otherwise stabilize. When a crisis gets bad enough that neighboring governments start building entirely new institutions just to manage the fallout, that tells you the existing structure of deterrence has already failed. It failed months ago. Everything since has been an attempt to patch a hole that keeps tearing wider. Follow the money for a second, because the economic mechanics underneath this crisis explain a lot of the behavior on every side of it. A quarter of the world's seaborne oil and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas do not simply reroute overnight when a choke point like this becomes unstable. Alternative pipeline capacity around the region exists, but it is limited, and it cannot absorb the full volume that normally transits the strait. That means every night of uncertainty here gets priced into global energy markets almost immediately, through futures contracts, through insurance premiums on any vessel willing to attempt the crossing, and through the war risk surcharges shipping companies now quietly build into freight rates for this specific route. Every disabled tanker, every mine claim, whether confirmed or disputed by Central Command, becomes a data point that traders and underwriters price into the cost of every barrel and every cargo moving through those 80 miles of water. That is why this story never actually stays contained to the region, no matter how local the individual strikes look on a map. A bridge outside Bandar Abbas and a fuel price in a country 5,000 miles away are connected by the same 80 miles of contested water. And that connection is exactly why 5 months of sustained American military pressure has not been enough on its own to force a clean resolution. The financial incentive for the Gulf states most exposed to this instability points toward pushing for a durable settlement. The financial incentive for whichever internal Iranian faction still believes disruption equals leverage points in the opposite direction. Those two incentives colliding night after night is a significant part of why this keeps reigniting instead of resolving. Now let's go inside the actual decision-making structure driving Iran's side of this, because that is the section most coverage skips entirely in favor of just describing the explosions. Iran's official government and its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have never operated as a single unified chain of command, even in peacetime, and the killing of the supreme leader in February only widened that gap. The Revolutionary Guard's naval and missile forces answer up through their own internal command structure, historically more insulated from the civilian government than most outside observers assume, with institutional interests of their own to protect, including control over smuggling networks, sanctioned trade routes, and the coastal infrastructure that generates real revenue for the organization, independent of the formal state budget. That is precisely why a diplomatic delegation can sign a memorandum of understanding in June, in good faith or not, while a separate operational arm of the same government is simultaneously authorizing missile strikes on tankers in another country's territorial waters in July. These are not necessarily the same decision-makers speaking with the same voice. They may not even be fully coordinating with each other in real time. A government fighting a war on this many fronts, with its founding religious authority recently killed, its navy repeatedly gutted since March, its export revenue squeezed by an active blockade since April, and its coastal command infrastructure being dismantled piece by piece in July, is a government under exactly the kind of internal strain that produces contradictory signals instead of a single coherent strategy. The prisoner release and the tanker strikes did not come from a single calm room making calm decisions. They came from a system straining in multiple directions at once, and that strain is the real story sitting underneath every individual headline this week. Let's talk about what these strikes are actually degrading on the ground, because the target list itself tells a story that the press releases do not spell out directly. Coastal surveillance facilities are how Iran tracks approaching vessels and hands off targeting data to its fast attack boats and shore-based missile batteries. Command centers are how the Revolutionary Guard coordinates the timing of mine-laying runs, drone launches, and missile strikes against tankers. Air defense sites are what is supposed to protect all of the above from exactly the kind of repeated aerial campaign the United States has been running since March. When American strike packages specifically target all three categories in the same operation, the objective is not a single dramatic explosion for a headline. The objective is severing the nervous system that lets Iran coordinate a coastal denial campaign at all. Take out the surveillance, and the fast boats are operating blind. Take out the command centers, and even the boats that do launch can't coordinate with each other. Take out the air defenses, and every subsequent strike gets easier and less risky for American pilots. This is not a series of unrelated attacks. This is a deliberate sequence designed to compound. This is the part most people miss when they only watch the highlight clips. On the 18th of July, residents on Qeshm Island, another key position inside the strait, reported that American aircraft had targeted the island multiple times over the preceding days, damaging parts of the island's infrastructure. In the same window, Iranian state media reported multiple explosions in Bandar Abbas itself. Both locations, sitting on or near the strait's narrowest choke point, being hit repeatedly in the same rolling campaign, is not a coincidence of geography. It is the campaign's entire logic laid bare. Whoever controls the physical points that pinch the strait down to its narrowest width controls the ability to threaten shipping through it. The United States is not trying to occupy Iran. It is trying to methodically dismantle every asset Iran has positioned along that specific stretch of coastline until the physical capability to threaten the strait simply no longer exists in usable form. And this is where the story stops being just a military campaign and becomes a story about command structure and internal Iranian politics as well. Because after 5 months of sustained losses, after the killing of the supreme leader that started this entire chapter, after 16 mine-laying boats destroyed in March, after a blockade squeezing oil revenue since April, after a ceasefire that collapsed within a week of being signed in June, the reasonable question is not whether Iran is losing ground. The reasonable question is who inside Iran is actually making the decisions that keep reigniting this fight even when a negotiated off-ramp is sitting right there on the table. A memorandum of understanding does not sign itself and then get violated by accident. Someone inside that command structure is choosing escalation over restraint over and over again, even when it costs the regime tankers, mine-laying boats, coastal surveillance infrastructure, and now its own bridges and tunnels, feeding its most important naval city. Now let's talk honestly about where the American side stands in its own public messaging, because that matters just as much as the Iranian side. President Trump has been notably blunt about the scale of American patience remaining here, comparing the current conflict to America's involvement in Vietnam. He pointed out that the United States fought there for 19 years, while this fight has run for a little over 4 months, arguing that 4 months already represents significant progress toward the administration's objectives. He has separately told reporters the strikes will continue until he says they are enough, language that leaves no ambiguity about an imminent unilateral stand-down. And in a primetime address this past week, he barely mentioned Iran directly, instead telling the public they would, quote, see the fruits of that labor very, very shortly. Read that carefully, because vague promises about imminent results, delivered without specifics, in the middle of an active bombing campaign, are exactly the kind of language that precedes either a major operational escalation or a diplomatic surprise. It could be either. What it clearly is not is language suggesting a quiet, gradual wind-down. There was one moment of genuine de-escalatory signaling in the middle of all of this, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than buried under the drumbeat of strikes. Iran released an American woman who had been detained since December of 2024, and President Trump publicly praised the gesture as an act of goodwill. That is a real data point, and it should not be dismissed. Prisoner releases in the middle of active hostilities are rarely accidental. They are usually a signal, sent through the only channel a regime under this much pressure still has left, that some appetite for de-escalation exists somewhere inside the decision-making structure. The question this story cannot yet answer is whether that appetite belongs to the same faction ordering strikes on tankers in Omani waters 4 days later, or whether it represents a genuinely different center of gravity inside a government that is visibly not moving with one voice. That is the structural risk sitting underneath every strike report coming out of this region right now, and it is the thing that should actually keep serious analysts awake at night more than any single explosion. A government that releases a detained American as a goodwill gesture on one day and gets accused of striking tankers in another country's territorial waters 4 days later is not behaving like a unified command issuing consistent orders. It is behaving like a fractured system where different factions are pulling in different directions at the same time, each one convinced their approach is the one that saves the regime. When a nuclear-adjacent, missile-armed, mine-capable government starts showing those kinds of internal contradictions in full public view, the danger is not that one faction makes a rational, calculated decision to escalate. The danger is that nobody is fully in control of the moment when an accidental strike, a miscalculated intercept, or an unauthorized mine-laying run pushes this past a threshold nobody intended to cross. Command fragmentation inside a state actor, with the capability Iran still retains even in its degraded state, is a far more dangerous variable than any single confirmed strike package this week. Now widen the lens for a second, because this is not happening in isolation from the rest of the world's military posture. And pretending it is happening in a vacuum misses the bigger picture entirely. While the United States has spent the last 6 nights running sustained strike packages against Iranian coastal targets, other major militaries have been conducting their own signaling exercises elsewhere on the map, a reminder that the strategic environment surrounding this specific fight has not stood still while Washington and Tehran trade fire over 80 miles of water. None of that changes the specific facts on the ground in the strait. But it is worth remembering that a prolonged, visible American military commitment concentrated in one theater does not happen without other global actors watching, calculating, and adjusting their own posture in response, even quietly, even without a single headline generated on a given day. There is one more piece of this picture worth naming plainly, because it is the variable that turns a bad situation into an uncontrollable one. Every one of the last 6 nights has involved American aircraft operating in close proximity to Iranian air defense systems that are being actively suppressed, disputed, and in some cases destroyed, while Iranian forces are simultaneously claiming successful strikes on tankers that the United States is publicly calling false. That is a battle space where both sides are making real-time claims about what just happened on the water and in the air, and where the actual ground truth is being contested in public statements almost as fast as the strikes themselves occur. In a fight that compressed, with that much simultaneous claim and counterclaim, the risk is not that either side deliberately chooses to escalate past a red line. The risk is that an unconfirmed mine detonation, a misidentified vessel, or a surveillance gap caused by a degraded coastal radar site produces a response that neither side actually intended in a stretch of water already saturated with military assets from multiple nations. That is the scenario regional militaries and shipping insurers are quietly the most worried about, more than any single confirmed strike package. Not a deliberate war-ending escalation, but an accidental one, born out of exactly the kind of command fragmentation and simultaneous claim and counterclaim that has defined this exact week. Here's the honest strategic assessment, stripped of the theatrics that usually surround this kind of coverage. Iran's 5-month strategy has been consistent, even as it has failed to achieve its stated objective. Close the strait, absorb the strikes, wait out American political patience, and try to extract concessions at the negotiating table using the threat of continued disruption as leverage. That strategy has cost Iran 16 mine boats in March, a full naval blockade since April, a memorandum of understanding it apparently could not or would not hold to in June, and now 6 consecutive nights of strikes against its command centers, air defenses, surveillance infrastructure, and the physical roads feeding its most important naval city in July. Every metric of that exchange favors the United States on paper. And yet, the strait remains a live flashpoint 5 months later, oil is still being disrupted, seafarers are still dying, and neither side has produced a durable political resolution. That gap between overwhelming tactical dominance and the absence of a lasting strategic outcome is the actual story here, more than any single night of airstrikes. What happens in the next 48 to 72 hours likely depends less on any single American strike package and more on whether the internal Iranian contradiction resolves itself, and in which direction. If the faction willing to release detained Americans as goodwill gestures gains real control over operational decisions, you would expect to see mine-laying incidents and tanker strikes taper off, even while political rhetoric stays defiant for domestic consumption. If instead the faction responsible for striking tankers in Omani waters and denying it afterward remains operationally dominant, expect the current pattern to continue exactly as it has for 6 nights running. American strikes against coastal infrastructure, Iranian claims of mines and rogue tankers that Central Command publicly disputes, and a slow accumulation of damaged ships, dead seafarers, and disabled export capacity, with no clean resolution visible on the horizon. Consider what has actually changed and what has not changed across these 5 months. What has changed is the physical inventory of what Iran can still threaten the strait with. 16 mine-laying vessels destroyed in March is 16 fewer boats available for exactly the kind of nighttime harassment operations that made the strait dangerous in the first place. A sustained naval blockade since April is revenue Iran has not collected on oil it could not export. A command center, a surveillance facility, and an air defense site degraded in a single coordinated operation this month is a measurable reduction in Iran's ability to coordinate whatever assets it has left. What has not changed is the underlying political calculation that made Iran shut the strait in the first place. The belief that disruption of global energy flows is the one form of leverage a conventionally overmatched regime still has available against a superpower it cannot fight ship for ship or jet for jet. As long as that calculation holds anywhere inside the Iranian command structure, the physical degradation of assets will keep happening, and the underlying willingness to try again with whatever is left will keep resetting the clock on this exact same fight. And that is the part the mainstream 2-minute segment coverage keeps missing entirely, because it treats every night's strikes as a standalone story instead of connecting the March mine boats to the April blockade, to the June memorandum, to the July tanker strikes, to the bridges outside Bandar Abbas this week. This is one continuous campaign with one continuous underlying cause. A regime that lost its supreme leader in February, shut a waterway it does not fully control in retaliation, and has spent every month since trying to prove that closure still means something, even as the United States methodically dismantles the physical infrastructure that gives that closure any teeth at all. So, go back to that bridge outside Bandar Abbas, the one that no longer exists in the shape it did 5 days ago. That single piece of damaged infrastructure is not just a tactical target on a strike list, it is the physical symbol of what this entire 5-month war has actually been about since the day it started. Whether a regime that no longer has the conventional strength to defend its own coastline can still convince the rest of the world that it controls one of the most important waterways on the planet. 6 nights of strikes into this latest chapter, with tankers hit in another country's territorial waters, with a seafarer dead, with an entire nation of sailors pulling out of the strait rather than risk the crossing, with the president publicly promising results very, very shortly without saying what those results will be, the honest answer is that nobody outside a very small circle actually knows how this specific chapter ends. What is certain is that the 80 miles of water between Bandar Abbas and the Omani coast are still the single most dangerous stretch of ocean on Earth tonight, and whatever happens there next will not stay contained to a regional headline. It never has.